Death, you never forget that, ever. I've smelled it too often.
And investigators must face their worst nightmare.
My child had been shot twice in the head.
I saw my son Dan laying there in those pajamas.
There are always certain cases you'll never shake. This is one of them.
In the search for truth,
sometimes things aren't what they appear to be.
Kenda is pushed to his ultimate breaking point.
Son of a bitch.
The rage is consuming me, and I lost it. I looked at dead people every day, thousands of them over my career. And you are surrounded in a sea of violence, and you start to realize that maybe I am drowning. August 30th, 1989, I'm a sergeant in homicide. I was in my office at 3 o'clock in the afternoon reviewing old murder cases.
It's Kenda.
Sergeant, you're needed in the conference room.
Okay.
So that she would never reveal it. So I go to the conference table. The room is pure white. Well, that's a little odd. The table, the chairs, the walls, everything in the room is white. And sitting around the table are the victims of my cases. They're in various states of decomposition. Their clothing is torn, there are insects crawling on them. There is a river of dead that flows past me every night. When I wake up from one of these dreams, I'm sick to my stomach and soaking wet.
Joe, are you okay?
I could tell when he was having a nightmare because he'd thrash around in the bed.
Was it that dream again? Do you want to talk about it?
No, I'm okay.
He would shut down. He would be quiet. He wouldn't say anything. He'd stare off in the distance.
As a child, I was not aware of Dad having nightmares, not at all. He was very strong for us.
It was bad enough that my mom had to deal with it, and I think he was just conscious about not wanting to burden his kids with that as well.
I wish you'd talk to me about your job. I hate seeing you so upset, and I don't even know what's going on.
I never told Kathy for a long time, years, I never told her. I thought it was just cruel. Why do that? Why make her suffer like I'm suffering?
Well, if you don't talk to me, you should talk to someone.
I'm gonna head to the station, get an early start.
It was maddening at times. He'd just keep on doing whatever he was going to do.
I had always treated my employment as a mission, that I was going to make a difference in the world no matter what it took or no matter what the cost. I had not given much thought to retirement, but there were parts of my brain that kept knocking at that door. And I'm thinking, what are you going to do when you grow up? What are you going to do when you stop doing this and looking at dead people? And it was a fleeting thought.
Let's get it.
I had no clue when that call came in that this would be a situation I would never, ever forget. And to this day, I still cannot forget.
The Shangri-La Trailer Park was one street over from the station where I worked for quite a few years. It's a really nice mobile home park. It's very well kept.
Thanks.
The officer standing on the porch of this trailer knows me. He looked at me, and next to his leg, he held 3 fingers. Now, he's telling me there are 3 dead people in this trailer. And I'm thinking, oh, great.
So what do we got?
This one's a real bad one.
Any witnesses?
The landlord. But he's really distraught right now.
Hey, Joe.
Dave?
Got here as soon as I could.
I had actually been on Colorado Springs Police Department for approximately 9 years.
Let's take a look inside.
I was off duty that day, and I just happened to be on call.
Oh, man. That's bad.
So we walk into this trailer. It's hot. There are flies in the place attracted by the blood. There's a woman in the kitchen sitting on the floor, halter top pair of shorts, in her early 30s. When you smell death, you never forget that. Ever. I've smelled it too often.
Looks like she's been here all night.
You become rather accomplished at determining time of death because you see so much of it. Based on the blood and the rigor mortis in the body, I would say 12 hours.
2 gunshot wounds to the head. Close range, small caliber.
I recall her being propped up against the refrigerator in a very awkward position, as if she had not expected that shot that came her way.
We have an ID on the body?
Yeah, we found her driver's license.
She is Cynthia Anderson, and she's 32 years old.
As detectives scan the crime scene for clues, they narrow in on a curious detail.
Is it just me or does it look bare in here?
Yeah, just a Bible, some dirty dishes, and a purse. Did you find anything in there?
Just a wallet, no cash or valuables.
At first blush, Kenda wonders if the carnage in the trailer is a robbery gone awry.
You look at this trailer, the first instinct you have is there any evidence of forced entry?
Yeah, the door looks undisturbed.
Yes, sir. We checked all the windows. They're all secure.
The idea of this being a burglary by a stranger does not have any apparent facts to support that, initially at least.
Where are the other victims at?
Back here in the bedroom.
There is a Caucasian male, approximately 30 years old, laying on the floor. He's got a gunshot wound to the right temple. And there is a Jennings .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol on the floor.
Hammer's cocked. Looks like it's been fired.
The pistol is ready to fire again. So you have to be careful when you handle these things because you touch that trigger and somebody's going to get shot.
I thought you said there were 3 victims.
In the bed.
There is a 5-year-old boy clutching a stuffed animal. This kid has 2 entry-exit contact gunshot wounds to the side of his head. And because of the angle of the bed, he has bled out. He's wearing pajamas. My son had those pajamas when he was little. The very same ones.
Joe, you okay?
I saw my son Dan laying there. in those pajamas. The 2 holes in his head.
Joe.
I gotta go outside. Sorry.
When you start doing this for a living, you build armor around your heart. You have to protect yourself from the horrors that you see. But there are times when something will go through that armor like a stiletto. We're investigating the death of 3 people by violent means. We know who one of them is, Cynthia Anderson, and she's 32 years old, and an unknown male. And even worse, we have a child, very small. It's the worst nightmare scenario involving the violent death of a child, but it's something you have to get to the bottom of. I have to. It's my job.
Sadly, I have covered several of these cases, and they don't leave you, ever. Particularly when you have children, it's just too easy for your head to go, what if that were mine?
Hey, Kath, it's me.
When he was working, sometimes he would call and say, won't be home for dinner.
Honey, you don't sound so good.
There's a kid involved.
I knew the kids really got to him, the young adults even, and the children and the babies.
That was an unspoken moment between she and I. She never questioned me as to what happened. All she wanted to know was that I was still alive.
Don't wait up for me.
Okay. I love you.
I love you too. Bye.
Children were always my kryptonite. I mean, I just could not get past that. I could not. And I would do whatever it would take to punish the person responsible for that event.
Yeah, sorry about that. I had to check in with my wife.
Of course.
Did you find any IDs on those 2 bodies?
Moore tells me they've identified the male in the back bedroom as 32-year-old Scott Anderson, and he is the husband of Cynthia Anderson, who's dead in the kitchen. And their child, 5-year-old Scotty.
All of the gunshot wounds appear to be consistent with the 22 found in the bedroom.
Most likely scenario, Scott worked out the whole family.
This has the initial appearance to me of being a murder-suicide. That's my opinion.
While the scene suggests that Scott Anderson killed his own wife and child before turning the gun on himself, it's still entirely possible that someone else is responsible.
We have one opportunity to really get it right and make sure that we're not jumping to conclusions.
We need to find out if anyone stopped in this trailer last night.
I'm on it.
The issue in any case involving multiple victims is, who is a potential enemy of these people? So I'm going to talk to the person who called it in, which is the owner of the trailer.
This is Mark Brown.
I'm Sergeant Kenda. Mind if I ask you a few questions?
Okay.
Can you just walk me through what happened this morning?
Yeah, well, my wife, Jenny, came over to help them pack some boxes. Supposed to be moving out tomorrow.
When he got to the trailer, he got no answer at the door.
You talked to her, right?
She said she'd be home all morning.
Mr. Brown reports that he knocked several times, and when he didn't get a response,
Hey, Cynthia?
he tried the doorknob and it wasn't locked.
Typically in a landlord situation, you would not go in, but they were friends and they were helping her.
Cindy?
What the hell is that smell?
What?
First thing he sees is Cynthia Anderson shot to death on the kitchen floor.
Jenny, no, stop.
What?
She's dead. All right, she's dead.
What?
I'd never seen anything like this.
And what happened next?
He said he went to a neighbor and found a phone and called the police. And then he sent his wife home because she was so overcome with grief.
Did you go inside the trailer?
No. I just opened the door. Please tell me that little boy is okay.
I said, Mr. Brown, I'm very sorry to inform you that little boy is certainly not okay. He was overcome by that. He liked that little kid. Who wouldn't?
That's okay. We can talk later.
With no other promising leads, the pressure is on for Kenda to find out who killed the entire Anderson family.
Fighting crime / bringing justice was an obsession for Joe. It really bugged him when he couldn't get the knot completely unraveled. I mean, there are still a couple of those cases, and they drive him nuts.
Kenda, you have a minute? This is Cheryl Wright, one of the neighbors. She thinks she may have overheard the shooting.
Yeah, I mean, it was late.
She indicated that sometime around 11 p.m. that evening, she recalls hearing gunshots.
Heard like 4 or 5 loud pops. It sounded like fireworks. Then I heard a car drive off.
Did you see who got in the car?
No, I didn't see the car. I just heard it.
Oh, thank you for your time.
Sure.
What do you think?
It's hard to say. At first I thought Scott killed the whole family. Now it's starting to look like there's a third person involved.
According to what Cheryl Wright says, it's still possible that there could be someone else involved in this.
This throws another avenue into the equation. So it is extremely critical to make sure that we focus on what we know is factual.
We need to find out more about this family.
Have they had a confrontation in the recent past with perhaps a neighbor or a coworker or something like that?
I'll go check next to Ken, touch base with you later.
Great. I'll hang around here until the scene's wrapped up.
Later that evening, Detective David Moore checks in with Kenda on his findings.
I tracked down Scott and Cynthia's family. They're all over Wisconsin.
Really?
Also pulled a background check on Scott and Cynthia. Found something odd.
Moore also determines that they own a home together, Scott and Cynthia Anderson, and it's located on Manitoba Drive, about a 40-minute drive from the trailer park.
Strange, right? Maybe they were renovating.
I don't know. Let's look into this.
So now the question is obvious. Why do you need 2 households? We don't know. It's our business to find out. We're investigating the death of Cynthia Anderson, her husband Scott, and her 5-year-old son Scotty from multiple gunshot wounds. We need to know what's going on in this family, and how could that lead us to who might have done this.
I set up a meeting for us early tomorrow morning.
Good.
Detective Moore had set up an interview with John Howell, who is a business partner to Mr. Anderson, to see what he may know about this family.
Great work. I'm gonna head home, get a shower and some shut-eye. You should too.
I probably won't sleep. But you gotta try, right?
With heavy hearts, Kenda and Moore head home to their families. But the memories of the crime scene still haunt them.
It certainly affected me as a father. I remember going home that evening and actually waking my son up and holding on to him and just thank God that he was there and safe.
It was always difficult for me to go home when you're working at murder case and walk in the door and be all smiles.
We knew that Dad sometimes had rougher cases than normal, just by body language and by the level of stress.
Joe, is that you?
Hey.
Sometimes it was very hard for him to come home and shut it off.
Are you hungry? I saved you some chicken.
And I was thinking about that child in those pajamas.
Oh, I heard from Dan today. He's really liking his classes at college.
My son was 19 years old.
We have to pick out a weekend and go visit him. Joe.
I'm sorry, I'm not hungry.
I know you've had a tough day, but I need you to talk to me.
I think Kathy was upset on a number of occasions that I wouldn't let her in.
Sometimes I would be very sympathetic to it. Sometimes I would get very mad at it.
Maybe it's time to think about doing something different.
What?
Retiring, getting a new job, because this one's killing you.
Kathy became increasingly concerned that I would die as a result of this work, either at someone's hand or at a health problem that I would create by my never sleeping and eating bad food and all the things you do.
You know that's impossible. Just can't deal with this right now.
Me neither. I'm going to bed.
And in my heart of hearts, I knew that Kathy was potentially right.
The next morning, Kenda and Moore meet with Scott's business partner, John Howell, hoping for additional insight into the Anderson family.
Good morning, Mr. Howell.
Call me John.
John was a individual who owned a commercial window washing business.
I'm Sergeant Kenda, this is Detective Moore. Thank you for talking to us.
It's unbelievable. The whole family just gone. Who would do such a horrible thing?
Mr. Howell did say that there's no way Scott Anderson would have ever hurt his wife or his child. In his opinion, they're a loving, caring family, and they go to church on Sunday.
Scott and Cynthia had actually met one another in Wisconsin.
Cynthia was pretty far along with her pregnancy. The natural father left her, in a bad way.
Scott Anderson not only stepped up to dating a pregnant woman, but went so far as to name the baby after himself. He raised that child from birth to age 5.
They got married and moved here about 3 years ago. That's when we met. Started working together.
We understand they have a house on Manitoba Drive. Do you have any idea why they were living in a trailer on the other side of town?
Scott wasn't living there, just Cynthia and the boy.
Really?
He said that 2 months prior to this event, that Scotty and Cynthia abruptly moved out of the house. So we asked Mr. Howell, why would they do that?
Was Scott seeing anyone else outside of the marriage?
No way. Scott and Cynthia were good Christians. And Scott said there's a bit of a squabble. Didn't say what.
But they were getting it settled, and Scott had told him he'd even prayed about it.
As a matter of fact, Scott had redecorated the home they had been living in, got new curtains, and was fully expecting Cynthia to move back.
All right, well, thank you for your time.
We're sorry for your loss.
My opinion of Mr. Howell is he knows little or nothing about these people's marriage or about their relationship. He's a business partner to this guy. He's not in his life. He doesn't know anything about his life.
But Kenda knows someone close to the Andersons that might be able to give him the insight he needs.
Now, we have never talked with Jenny Brown, the wife of the landlord. It's time to talk to Jenny to see what she can tell us.
Jenny was not in the emotional shape to be able to give a statement the night that the bodies were discovered. But she's got some information that's really gonna blow this open.
So how did you come to know the Andersons?
We met them through that awful church. Luckily, Mark and I escaped.
Excuse me?
She says it's a non-traditional church, and it's almost cultish.
Scott was so devoted. I swear to God, if they hadn't joined that church, they'd still be alive today.
Her opinion was that they all died because of this cult-like church. Well, that's something new now, isn't it? We've been investigating the shooting death of the Anderson family, Cynthia, her husband Scott, and their 5-year-old son Scotty. We've learned this might have occurred because of Scott's devotion to the church.
Why do you say that?
This church was very restrictive, and Scott took their teachings to the extreme. Cindy wasn't allowed to work or drive a car, and any extra money that they had went to that church.
Every man, according as he has purpose.
And the money that Scott was giving to this church was actually impacting his family and their ability to meet their needs.
He was just becoming more irrational every day. It was like it was all or nothing with Scott. It was crazy.
There was a lot of controlling factors involved in this church.
Cindy, what is this?
Just Scotty's lunch.
Cindy, what is wrong with you? This is not nourishment. This is not what God intends for our child.
He's gotta eat, he's starving.
He's not eating that.
He used the Bible as an excuse to treat his wife like a slave.
He had gotten in his mind that processed foods were evil. And because all their money went to that church, she couldn't even afford to buy groceries.
And Scott Anderson was so devoted to this way of thinking that he told Jenny he'd rather see his son go hungry than eat these evil food products. Oh, swell.
A couple of months ago, she showed up on my doorstep with Scotty. Scott had hit her so hard that he knocked out one of her teeth.
We don't know exactly how, but he also abused Scotty. And for Cynthia, that was that. She made arrangements to get out, go to the mobile home, because nobody was going to hurt her baby.
So they moved in, and things were looking up. But Scott figured out where she was working, and he followed her to the trailer.
Which is very common in the abusive male personality. Mr. Anderson makes it his business to find them.
That bastard had to have the last word.
In Jenny's mind, there's no doubt that Scott Anderson is responsible for the deaths. Given the physical evidence I saw at the scene and knowing this, I don't disagree with her.
We'll let ourselves out.
We're sorry for your loss.
I just thought of something. Remember that Bible back at the crime scene?
Yeah.
When we get back to the station, want to have someone pull that from the evidence locker?
Found it.
Nobody's touched it since. It is.
So we open this up and start fanning through it. And in the middle of the Bible is a note. We take that out carefully.
They kept saying the same thing over. Why are you leaving me? This is not right. We need to make sure we get back together and make this work. It was a very disturbing note because there were threatening comments there.
Sick bastard.
While the evidence is overwhelming that Scott Anderson killed his entire family, Kenda and Moore need the coroner to make the final ruling.
So we stopped down to the morgue.
Hey, Doc. Hey. So what do you think?
The autopsies have been complete on all three people.
So Scott's wound to his right temple was a contact wound. I'm confident that it was self-inflicted. I think he turned the gun on his family and then turned it on himself. So I'm ruling this a double murder-suicide. But there's one more thing. She was pregnant.
What?
Yeah, it was early on. I'm not even sure that she knew herself.
It makes me sick to my stomach that Scott not only achieved his goal of killing his wife, killing her child, but killing their child also. I mean, that is pretty damn close to demonic.
Based on the evidence and witness statements, Kenda can surmise what happened to the Anderson family.
Scott!
My opinion is that he showed up at her house unannounced.
It's not a good time. You need to leave.
Not going anywhere until you listen to what I gotta say. You are my wife, and this isn't right. God is gonna punish you if you don't straighten up. Is that what you want?
I think he probably introduced that Bible into that house, pointing at it, pounding his fist on it.
Scott, it's over. Scotty and I are never, ever gonna move back in that house with you. I'm done. You need to get out.
Cindy, I talked to God today. He will save us all.
He's got a loaded gun in his pocket. He pulls out that gun.
He will save us all.
He then immediately walks down that bedroom hallway. His son is asleep in a bed. He puts that gun against his head. And shoots him twice. Bang, bang. And he steps back. And then the case was closed. We have a suspect who is deceased, Scott Anderson.
Nice work, Joe. Time to go home and get some rest.
What's so nice about it? The whole family's dead.
Joe, let's go home.
There are moments in my career when I was filled with venom. There is no justice in a murder-suicide. There's only the taking of human life for no true, definable reason.
There are always certain cases you'll never shake. This is one of them.
In the subsequent weeks and months, the Anderson case haunts Kenda on a nightly basis.
I'm like frozen solid, staring at this kid with gunshot wounds to the head in my son's pajamas. And I can't close my eyes. And I can't leave the room. When I would wake up like that, and I'd be soaked with sweat, and I'd be shaking and sitting on the bed, I'd look at Kathy, and she's just peacefully sleeping away like an angel.
The nightmares continue to take their toll until one day a case comes in that pushes Kenda to his breaking point.
I came into work, and it was a terrible start to the day. We were overwhelmed.
I got a guy in room 4 ready to confess, but I got to go on a call.
What about you? Nobody?
Okay, I'll do it. Give me the file.
One of the people under arrest was a 74-year-old man who'd been arrested for sexual assault on a child. The victim was 5 years old.
Damn. That's repulsive. Okay, go. I got this. All right, appreciate it. Thanks.
About time.
Lieutenant Kenda, I understand you want to make a statement?
Yes, sir.
When I start talking to him, even though my skin is crawling at the time.
So how do you know this child?
My grandson. He's my daughter's youngest.
The rage is consuming me. I feel like I'm a volcano and I'm going to erupt.
I think we have a great relationship. Go to the park, do puzzles.
Why'd you do that to that little boy?
He came on to me.
And I lost it.
You son of a bitch.
In late August of 1996, I realized that my emotions were interfering with my ability to do my job. And I didn't realize how overwhelmed I was until I was talking to that old man about what he did to a 5-year-old boy.
You son of a bitch, I'd kill you myself.
I really think about all the ways I could kill this guy. and how much fun it would be to watch him die.
Lieutenant. Joe, are you okay?
This guy's crazy.
You shut your mouth.
And I said, get him out of my sight. Right now. Now.
Get up.
Go.
I know what I needed to do. I had been on the police department for 23 years and 6 months to the day, which equates to 106 years of doing anything else. And I sat there and I was sick to the stomach and my heart was going 400 beats a minute. I felt I was losing control of me, that I was becoming someone I didn't care for. I didn't want that to be my legacy, that I was turning into some sort of a monster, so it was time to stop that. I tortured my own family, and I tortured myself on behalf of the citizenry of Colorado Springs. So I typed a single sentence. As of September 1, 1996, I am retired from the Colorado Springs Police Department. And I signed it. And that was that. It felt like somebody lifted an aircraft carrier off my head. I didn't walk out of there. I floated because I was lighter than air. I had no retirement ceremony. I didn't want the stale coffee and the stale cake. It didn't interest me. I wasn't doing that anymore.
See you Monday.
I was there on Friday.
Here you go.
Thanks.
And I wasn't there on Monday.
I was thinking about where we could go on a vacation. Maybe rent a cabin for a weekend.
Sounds nice.
Once he handed in his badge, I was very grateful. All the times of him working long hours, I really had a lot of concerns. Now, I didn't have to worry about Joe getting shot and killed anymore.
So, what are you going to do today?
I have no idea.
Over the years, he slowly began to decompress.
And finally one day, Kathy looked at me and said, "You're the guy I married again." I wasn't a policeman when we got married. I thought that was very nice. Many years passed. I'd been retired for quite a while.
Good morning, Mr. Joe.
Good morning. So I thought I'd drive a school bus. Everybody take their seats, please.
And we're like, okay, Dad is driving a school bus. Never thought that would occur.
I loved it. The first job I ever had in my life, where everyone was happy to see me. Everybody ready to go to school?
Yeah.
Well, let's go to school in that case, all right? But there was always those nagging memories that pulled at me. PTSD happens when it chooses to. The best way to describe it is having a nightmare while you're awake. It takes your breath away. And it'll last for 15 or 20 seconds. And it's absolutely startling. I had kept everything bottled up in me when I was working, but now it's 8, 9, 10 years later. So I got a letter in the mail that changed my life. It's a letter from some guy that says he's going to put me on television. I'm like, that's going to happen.
And I said, well, you need to call him.
I'm not calling him.
No, you need to call him.
And she said, you know, I think it would be good for you to talk about these things. Finally, to keep peace in the family, I said, okay, I'll call him. Turns out he's a television producer who is very accomplished.
Basically, it was my mother who nagged him into it. That's probably the shortest version there.
What do you remember about that first interview you gave for the show?
The first season, the first time I started talking about this, it was a flood. They couldn't shut me up. It was like the dam broke. And here comes everything right now. I began to feel better, a little better all the time.
Because of talking on the show, the nightmares got less, the PTSD got less. The show helped him.
I think his analogy of the camera being like a therapist for him is true. People are not typically willing to share things that are painful to them. He is.
There's been a lot of benefits, actually, to the show. People want to talk to him and want to thank him for things that he's done. And he's just representative of many, many hardworking detectives that are out there in this country doing the exact same things, who aren't on TV, but are going through the exact same types of challenges in their lives.
And that's been very healing for him.
It has been my honor to entertain you. And it's also been my honor, hopefully, to educate you to some degree about how the world works and how people act and behave. And hopefully that can continue in some way. I've had a long and varied career, and I was successful at what I did. Will my passion ever stop for justice or finding the truth or locating people responsible for horrible things? No. That would never stop until I take my last breath. I put my badge down. I put it down. I can't put my desire down. It's part of me. If you could analyze my DNA, I think you'd find it there. Something I've always said, and I always meant. If you kill, I will find you.
It begins with a sound no one can quite place anymore. Not a scream, not a siren, just the hollow thud of a door closing somewhere in North London on a rain-soaked November night in 1987, a sound swallowed by traffic, by fog, by the ordinary noise of a city that never thinks it is about to become the backdrop for a cold case. The kind of case that doesn't explode immediately, doesn't flood headlines with answers, but instead seeps into the walls, into the pavements, into memory, and refuses to leave. 36 years later, detectives would still argue about that sound, about whether it mattered, about whether anyone truly heard it at all. The street was quiet in that particular way London gets after midnight, when even the pubs have given up and the city exhales. Street lamps flickered, throwing long, jaundiced shadows across parked cars and brick facades. A woman was walking home alone. Her name would later be repeated by anchors, whispered by neighbors, printed in bold black type. But on that night, she was just another figure moving through the dark, keys clenched between her fingers, coat pulled tight against the cold. She never made it home. By morning, the street would be cordoned off, blue and white tape snapping in the wind, and reporters would talk about a disturbing discovery, while police refused to confirm details. London, 1987. A disappearance that would become a mystery before anyone realized it was one. They found her belongings first. A handbag near a bus stop. A shoe several meters away, clean, almost deliberately placed. No blood. No signs of a struggle that made sense. Just absence. The kind that makes investigators uneasy because it suggests planning, control, and time. The first officers on the scene described it as wrong. Not violent enough. Not messy enough. Neighbors said they heard nothing. One man claimed he saw a van idling, engine running, lights off, but he couldn't describe the driver. Another witness swore she heard footsteps running, but by the time she looked out her window, the street was empty. Statements contradicted each other within hours, and the case began to fracture before it had even found a shape. Within days, the tabloids were circling. Mysterious van. One headline read, "Woman vanishes without trace," said another. The phrase cold case had not yet been applied, but the ingredients were already there. No body. No clear suspect. A city full of shadows and a police force under pressure to explain why a person could simply disappear from a residential street and leave behind nothing but questions. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors, re-interviewing witnesses, reconstructing timelines that never quite aligned. Every lead seemed promising for 12 hours, then collapsed under scrutiny. The van? Registered to dozens of companies. The bus stop? Hundreds of commuters passed through every night. The shoe? Common brand, mass-produced, untraceable. As weeks turned into months, the investigation narrowed, not because the truth was getting closer, but because options were running out. Friends described her as cautious, routine-oriented, unlikely to take risks. There was no history of running away, no secret life uncovered by financial records or phone logs. Her bank account went untouched. Her passport remained in a drawer. If she had left voluntarily, she had done so with a level of discipline that baffled even seasoned investigators. More likely, they concluded, she had been taken. But by whom, and how, and why, remained stubbornly out of reach. The community changed almost overnight. Doors locked earlier. Parents walked children to school. Neighborhood watch signs appeared in windows like talismans against fear. Every unfamiliar vehicle became suspicious. Every stranger was watched. And yet the city kept moving, indifferent and relentless, as if daring anyone to keep up. Inside the police station, the case file grew thick with paper and thin with hope. Tips flooded in at first, then slowed to a trickle. A man claiming psychic visions. Anonymous letters with no substance. Sightings that placed her everywhere from Brighton to Birmingham, none of them verifiable. Each call raised expectations, then dashed them. By the early 1990s, the case had cooled, though no one officially said the words. Detectives were reassigned. New crimes demanded attention. The file was boxed, labeled, shelved. But the unanswered questions lingered, gnawing at those who had worked it. Why was there no struggle? Why leave evidence behind if the abduction was planned? Why that street, that night? Theories hardened into factions within the department. One camp believed it was a crime of opportunity, a predator who got lucky and vanished. Another suspected someone local, someone who knew routines, someone who blended back into the neighborhood, so seamlessly that no one noticed. Without proof, arguments went in circles, and the case slipped quietly into the long sleep of a true cold case. Years passed. Technology advanced. DNA databases expanded. Old evidence was re-examined, then put back. Once, in the late 2000s, a partial profile sparked brief excitement, but it led nowhere. The public barely noticed. To most, the disappearance was a footnote, a grim story occasionally resurrected by anniversary articles and late-night documentaries. To those who remembered the street that night, it was unfinished business, a wound that never quite closed. Then, decades later, something shifted. A routine audit. A forgotten sample. A name that resurfaced not because of the case itself, but because of another investigation entirely. The details would not be released immediately, but inside Scotland Yard, whispers began to circulate. A suspect. Alive. Known. Someone who had lived a life in plain sight while a family waited for answers. When the arrest finally came, it was swift, quiet, almost anticlimactic. No dramatic chase. No public confession. Just handcuffs clicking shut in a suburban driveway and a stunned silence that spread faster than any headline. London 1987 cold case reopened. Suspect arrest shocks public. The words would soon be everywhere, but on that morning, before the press conferences and the speculation, there was only disbelief. After all this time, after all the dead ends, the case was breathing again. And with it came a chilling realization. Whatever happened on that foggy street had never truly been buried. It had been waiting, patient, unresolved. And as the city braced itself for answers, one truth remained unavoidable. Some mysteries do not fade. They endure quietly until the moment they decide to return. The arrest did not come with answers. It came with silence, with sealed court documents, with a single confirmation line from police that echoed across every newsroom in the city and then stopped. A man in his late 60s, taken into custody in connection with the 1987 disappearance. No name released. No charges announced. Just the word questioned, and a collective intake of breath from a public that had learned, long ago, not to hope too loudly. For detectives who had inherited the case rather than lived it, the file felt suddenly heavier in their hands, as if the past had decided to push back. Inside the interview room, the walls were bare, the lights unforgiving. The suspect sat calmly, almost politely, answering questions with the measured cadence of someone used to being listened to. He denied everything. He always had. Because this was not the first time his name had crossed a detective's desk. In 1987, he had lived 3 streets away from where the woman vanished. In 1987, he owned a van. In 1987, he had given a statement that placed him at home that night, alone, watching television. No one had challenged it hard enough at the time. No one had reason to. Back then, there had been nothing solid. Now, decades later, investigators wondered how many times they had walked past the answer without realizing it. The reopened case forced the city to remember details it had tried to forget. Old photographs resurfaced. Grainy black and white images of the street, the bus stop, the scattered belongings. Faces of witnesses, younger then, uncertain, staring into cameras with the brittle confidence of people convinced they had seen something important. Some of them were dead now. Others had moved away, built new lives, buried memories. Detectives tracked them down one by one, asking the same questions again, hoping time had sharpened what stress had dulled. Sometimes it had. More often, it hadn't. One witness, an elderly woman who still lived on the same street, remembered the van differently now. Darker, she said. Larger. Or maybe smaller. She couldn't be sure. She remembered the way it idled, the unnatural stillness of it, like an animal waiting. She remembered thinking she should look again, and deciding not to. That decision haunted her. Another man admitted he had lied in his original statement, not out of malice, but fear. He had been drinking that night. He hadn't wanted trouble. He hadn't wanted to be involved. The truth, whatever it was, had been eroded by human instinct long before detectives could preserve it. The suspect's life, once scrutinized, revealed nothing dramatic.
A job.
A family. No criminal record that matched the violence investigators imagined. Neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, forgettable, the most dangerous quality of all. Yet the timelines began to wobble under renewed pressure. His alibi relied on no one but himself. His van had been sold years later, scrapped without forensic examination. A coincidence, perhaps. Or a convenience. Police could not say, not yet. They followed procedure, methodical, restrained, aware that the weight of expectation could crush a case as easily as negligence. Meanwhile, the media filled the vacuum. Speculation bloomed. Talk shows debated theories with the certainty of people far removed from evidence. Online forums resurrected rumors from the 1990s, stitching them together into narratives that felt compelling and dangerous. Was it a lone predator? A serial offender whose other crimes had gone undetected? Or something closer, more intimate, more uncomfortable? Each possibility carried its own horror, and the public consumed them all, desperate for closure and afraid of what it might look like. Inside the investigation, the past collided with the present through technology. Old evidence was sent to modern labs. Fibers once dismissed as inconclusive were reanalyzed. A partial DNA profile, long considered useless, was run through databases that hadn't existed when the case began. It did not deliver a miracle. It delivered ambiguity, a familial link, a shadow of a connection that pointed in a direction but refused to settle. Detectives moved carefully, knowing that a misstep now would not just fail the case, but reopen old wounds with nothing to show for it. The family, long accustomed to disappointment, said little. They had learned how hope could hurt. Each development reopened questions they had trained themselves not to ask. Where had she gone? Had she suffered? Had she known, in her final moments, that no one would find her? The arrest did not bring relief. It brought dread. Because if this man was innocent, then the case was still adrift. And if he was guilty, then the truth would be worse than they imagined, shaped by decades of silence. As investigators reconstructed the night again, minute by minute, they noticed something that had been overlooked before. A gap. 12 minutes unaccounted for between the last confirmed sighting and the discovery of the belongings. 12 minutes in which anything could have happened, in which a quiet street could have become a crime scene and then returned to normal without anyone realizing it. That window became the center of gravity for the case. They mapped it, timed it, walked it themselves late at night, listening to the sounds, watching the shadows stretch and shrink. London had changed, but darkness hadn't. The suspects' reactions to these reconstructions were subtle. A pause too long. A correction that wasn't necessary. Nothing that would stand up in court on its own, but enough to keep detectives in the room. They pressed gently, then harder, circling the same questions from different angles, watching for fractures. He remained composed. He always had. The kind of composure that could be innocence or practice. Without a body, without a confession, the case balanced on a knife edge. And then there was the shoe, the one detail that refused to behave. Its placement suggested deliberation, not chaos. Someone had wanted it seen, or wanted it to mean something. In 1987, investigators lacked the language to articulate that unease. Now they did. Behavioral analysts weighed in, offering interpretations that ranged from staging to misdirection. None of them could agree. Each theory added texture, not clarity. As days turned into weeks after the arrest, the pressure mounted. Police faced a familiar enemy: time, custody limits, legal thresholds, the need for certainty in a case built on doubt. The public wanted a villain. The truth, detectives knew, might not cooperate. When the suspect was finally released pending further investigation, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Outrage, confusion, accusations of incompetence. The phrase cold case reclaimed its full meaning: icy and unresolved. Yet something had changed. The file was no longer dormant. Leads continued to surface, spurred by renewed attention. People remembered things they had never reported. A conversation overheard. A route altered that night. Each tip was logged, assessed, weighed. Most went nowhere. A few lingered, stubborn and uncomfortable. The arrest, even without charges, had cracked the surface of the past. And beneath that surface lay a truth that refused to stay quiet. Whatever happened in London in 1987 had not been a momentary lapse, not a random blip in an otherwise orderly city. It was a fracture, sealed over but never healed. As detectives prepared their next move, as the suspect returned to his ordinary life under extraordinary scrutiny, the question hung in the air, heavier than ever. Had they finally touched the edge of the answer, or merely disturbed a mystery that would consume another generation? Memory, detectives would learn, is not a straight line. It bends. It reshapes itself around fear, around guilt, around the quiet need to survive. As the case reopened, memory became both the weapon and the obstacle, cutting in unpredictable directions, refusing to stay still. Files once considered complete were pulled apart again, every statement reread as if it might confess something new under pressure. Ink faded. Paper yellowed. But the words remained, stubborn and dangerous. In 1987, the first interviews had been rushed. Too many questions. Too little time. Officers worked under the assumption that the woman would be found alive, that the disappearance was temporary, solvable, urgent, but not yet catastrophic. That assumption had shaped everything. Witnesses were allowed to drift. Contradictions were tolerated. Small inconsistencies were dismissed as nerves. Now, decades later, those same inconsistencies glowed like warning lights. One statement, buried deep in the file, began to attract attention. A young man at the time, a delivery driver, had reported seeing a woman matching the description speaking to someone near the van. Not arguing, not struggling, talking, calmly. He had described the man as familiar to her, or at least not threatening. The detail had been ignored. There were dozens of similar half-sightings. But when investigators tracked him down again, now middle-aged, his recollection sharpened in unexpected ways. He remembered the posture, the angle of her body, the way she stood with her weight shifted, relaxed, as if delaying rather than resisting. That memory unsettled the team, because it suggested consent, however brief, however false. If she had known her abductor, the suspect pool narrowed dramatically. The focus shifted inward, toward routine, toward people who existed within the orbit of her life rather than beyond it. Colleagues, neighbors, acquaintances who had never risen high enough on the list to be scrutinized. The reopened investigation began to feel less like a hunt and more like an excavation, careful and slow, every movement threatening collapse. The suspect, released but not cleared, felt the pressure immediately. Surveillance followed him discreetly. His phone records were monitored, his movements logged. He said little to anyone, but those closest to him noticed the change. A stiffness, a vigilance. He avoided eye contact with neighbors. He stopped walking his usual routes. When approached by reporters, he said nothing, but his silence spoke loudly enough. It fed the narrative, hardened public suspicion, and made every ordinary gesture feel rehearsed. Detectives, meanwhile, faced a more troubling possibility. What if the arrest had been premature? What if, in their desperation to revive the case, they had latched onto the most convenient figure rather than the correct one? Internal debates grew sharper. Some argued that the suspect fit too well, that coincidences stacked in his direction until they resembled intent. Others warned against confirmation bias, the seductive pull of finally believing the case could end. The truth, they knew, would not bend to hope. They returned again to the night itself. Weather reports, traffic patterns, bus schedules. London in 1987 was different, but it left traces. The rain had been light, intermittent, enough to smear reflections on the pavement, not enough to empty the streets entirely. Several buses passed through the area within the critical window. Each represented both a witness and a shield, potential eyes that might have seen something, potential noise that could have masked a crime. Investigators interviewed retired drivers, now scattered across the country. Most remembered nothing. One remembered a woman waiting longer than usual, pacing, glancing down the road. He remembered thinking she looked impatient, not afraid. That distinction mattered. Fear draws attention. Impatience blends in. As the case reopened, so did old wounds within the department. Retired officers were brought in for consultation, their memories probed gently, then insistently. Some welcomed the chance to revisit the case. Others resisted, uncomfortable with the implication that something had been missed. One former detective admitted, after hours of conversation, that he had always suspected the investigation had been steered away from someone too early. A local name, respectable, untouchable at the time. He could not prove it. He had never written it down, but the suspicion had never left him. That admission sent ripples through the team. They searched for the name, found it in the margins of the file, mentioned once, dismissed quickly. The man had provided an alibi corroborated by his wife. Solid. Ordinary. Closed. Except that the wife had since died. And the alibi, like so many others, rested on trust rather than evidence. Investigators approached the man carefully, presenting it as a routine follow-up. His reaction was immediate and defensive. Too sharp. Too quick. He demanded to know why, after all these years, he was being bothered again. The interview ended without answers, but with a sense of something unresolved. The public did not see this side of the investigation. They saw headlines. They saw speculation. They saw a suspect walk free. What they did not see was the slow accumulation of doubt, the way certainty slipped through fingers no matter how tightly detectives tried to hold it. The cold case was not warming. It was becoming more complex, branching into possibilities that refused to converge. One detail, long considered insignificant, began to take on new weight. A receipt found in the woman's coat pocket, time-stamped earlier that evening. She had stopped at a small shop, exchanged a few words with the cashier. The cashier had described her as distracted, preoccupied. In the reopened investigation, detectives tracked down the now-closed shop, the old security layout, the angle of the cameras. The footage was gone, of course, erased decades earlier. But the cashier remembered something else now. She remembered a man waiting outside. Not impatient. Watching. At the time, she had assumed they were together. Now, she wasn't so sure. That memory tightened the circle again. Familiarity. Proximity. The possibility that the encounter had been planned, timed, controlled. The idea that the woman had been guided rather than forced into disappearance. That idea chilled even the most experienced investigators. Because it suggested intention without chaos, violence without witnesses, a crime designed to dissolve into the city like smoke. As weeks passed, the suspect under surveillance made a mistake. Small. Human. He visited a location he had no obvious reason to visit, a place linked tangentially to the case. Not the street. Not the bus stop. Something adjacent. Investigators noticed immediately. They followed. They documented. They waited. When questioned later, he offered an explanation that didn't quite fit. Not enough to charge him. Enough to keep him close. The pressure was relentless. On detectives. On the suspect. On the family. Each new development reopened the same questions, twisted them slightly, then set them loose again. Had the arrest been a turning point, or a distraction? Were they closer to the truth, or circling it endlessly, like moths around a dim light? Late one evening, after another long day of interviews and analysis, a junior investigator noticed something others had missed. A pattern, faint but persistent, linking several witness statements that had previously been treated as unrelated. A sequence of movements. A timing coincidence too precise to ignore. It suggested not one decision, but several, made quickly, calmly, by someone who knew the area well. Someone who understood how London moved at night, how to slip between its rhythms without being noticed. The discovery did not solve the case. It did not point cleanly to a name. But it reframed the narrative. This was not a crime that happened to the city. It was a crime that used the city. Its noise. Its anonymity. Its indifference. As the investigation pressed forward, one truth became unavoidable. The longer the case remained open, the more dangerous it became. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it demanded. Answers. Accountability. An ending. And in a cold case this old, an ending might come at a cost no one was prepared to pay. By the time the investigation reached its 4th month since reopening, the past no longer felt distant. It pressed against the present with uncomfortable insistence, forcing every assumption into question. Detectives stopped asking what had happened and began asking how it had been allowed to disappear so completely. Because whatever occurred on that November night had not just taken a woman. It had erased a moment, scrubbed it clean enough that an entire city had walked over it for decades without realizing what lay beneath. The pattern identified by the junior investigator became the spine of the renewed inquiry. It wasn't a single clue, but a rhythm. A sequence of movements that, when layered over maps and timelines, suggested choreography. The woman's route home. The position of the van. The timing of buses and traffic lights. The brief lull when the street would have been neither empty nor busy, occupied just enough to discourage intervention and quiet enough to avoid attention. It was a narrow window, and it implied planning. Not meticulous, not cinematic, but practical. The kind of planning born from familiarity. That realization forced detectives to confront an uncomfortable truth. Whoever had taken her had likely rehearsed the night without ever calling it a rehearsal. They had known the street, the light, the soundscape. They had known when doors closed and when televisions went quiet. This was not a stranger passing through. This was someone who belonged there, or at least blended well enough to appear that way. The suspect under surveillance fit that profile too neatly to ignore. His movements, once considered mundane, were re-examined in this new light. His choice of routes. His tendency to linger near certain intersections. His knowledge of shortcuts that only locals used. None of it was illegal. None of it was proof. But together, it painted a picture that refused to be dismissed. Investigators began to wonder not whether he could have done it, but how often he had imagined it before that night. Pressure intensified behind closed doors. Senior officers demanded progress. Prosecutors wanted something concrete, something that could survive cross-examination and public scrutiny. The case was no longer just about truth. It was about credibility. After decades of silence, the city expected clarity, not another collapse into uncertainty. Detectives felt that weight every time they reopened the file, every time they revisited photographs of a street that looked ordinary enough to be anyone's. They decided to push harder. The suspect was called back in, this time under the guise of clarifying minor discrepancies. The interview room felt smaller now, more intimate, the air thick with unspoken accusation. They asked him to walk through the night again, minute by minute, forcing him to anchor memories that had floated unchallenged for years. He complied, patient, cooperative. Too cooperative. When pressed on details he should not remember so clearly, he faltered. When questioned on things he should recall easily, he grew vague. The contradictions were subtle, but they accumulated, a quiet erosion of certainty. Outside the station, the community watched and waited. The case had reignited old fears, especially among those who had lived in the area in the late 1980s. People compared memories, reconstructed their own timelines, wondered how close they had been without knowing it. Some felt anger at the police, convinced that incompetence had stolen decades of justice. Others felt a more personal guilt, the nagging suspicion that they had seen something, heard something, and chosen not to look closer. The investigation widened again, not by choice but necessity. Detectives re-examined associates of both the woman and the suspect, searching for overlap. They found it in unexpected places. A shared pub, a mutual acquaintance, a charity event attended months before the disappearance. Each connection was thin, deniable, but together they suggested proximity. The idea that their paths might have crossed before that night, that familiarity might have been established quietly, without witnesses, without records, unsettled everyone involved. Then there was the matter of motive. For years, the absence of obvious motive had stalled the case. There was no clear financial incentive, no documented conflict, no history of obsession. But as investigators dug deeper, motive began to feel less like a missing piece and more like a misunderstanding. Not every crime announces its reason. Some are born from opportunity, from impulse restrained just enough to appear controlled. The possibility that the disappearance had been driven by something transient, something that left no trace, made it harder, not easier, to explain. A breakthrough seemed imminent when forensic analysts reported unusual findings from re-examined fibers. Not definitive, not damning, but inconsistent with the environment where the belongings were found. The fibers suggested another location, briefly, before the items were placed where they would be discovered. That implied movement. Staging. A decision made after the fact. The news rippled through the team, cautious optimism tempered by the knowledge that defense attorneys thrived on ambiguity. When detectives confronted the suspect with this information, his reaction was different. Not defensive. Not angry. Confused. Or convincingly so. He asked questions. He leaned forward. He wanted details. The behavior split opinion immediately. Some saw it as the mask slipping, curiosity betraying involvement. Others saw genuine bewilderment. The line between the two was razor-thin, and the case balanced on it. As the days grew shorter and public patience thinner, another figure reemerged from the shadows of the file. A man once interviewed briefly, then dismissed, now deceased. His name surfaced through a witness who had been reluctant to speak before. She described an argument she had overheard weeks prior to the disappearance, heated, personal, involving a woman who could have been the victim. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. Arguments were common. Now, she wondered if she had mistaken noise for insignificance. The revelation complicated everything. A dead man could not defend himself. He could not be interrogated. He could not be charged. But his existence offered an alternative narrative, one that threatened to fracture the focus of the investigation once again. Detectives faced a choice: pursue the new lead and risk diluting their case, or stay the course and risk missing the truth. They chose neither completely. They followed both paths, carefully, quietly, aware that every step forward seemed to open two new directions backward. The cold case was alive now, but it was not cooperative. It resisted resolution, pushing back against every attempt to impose order. Late one night, alone in the office, a senior investigator stared at the map of the street, pins marking decades of theories. He removed one, then another, until only a few remained. What troubled him most was not what they didn't know, but what they might never be able to prove. In cases this old, truth and proof were not always allies. As the investigation moved into its next phase, the city waited for a decisive moment. An arrest. A charge. A confession. Something solid enough to anchor belief. But beneath the surface, a quieter fear took hold. That the case, having come back from the dead, might refuse to die again. That its final legacy would not be justice, but the enduring realization that some crimes are designed to outlast the people who try to solve them. The deeper the investigation went, the more it began to feel like the city itself was complicit. Not in the crime, but in its concealment. London had changed its face so many times since 1987 that even the streets seemed reluctant to remember what they once were. Buildings had been renovated, bus routes altered, alleyways sealed off or reopened under new names. Yet beneath the modern surfaces, the old geometry remained, and detectives learned to read it like a palimpsest, searching for traces of a night that refused to stay buried. With two potential narratives now competing for attention, the team split its focus. One group pursued the living suspect, tightening surveillance, revisiting every documented movement of his adult life. The other followed the shadow of the deceased man, reconstructing his final years through secondhand accounts and paper trails. Neither path offered comfort. Both were riddled with gaps large enough to swallow certainty whole. The deceased man's history, once examined closely, was more volatile than anyone had realized. He had drifted between jobs, between addresses, between social circles. He knew the area well. Too well. He had argued publicly with several people, though none of those conflicts had ever escalated into violence, at least not officially. One former acquaintance described him as unpredictable, capable of warmth one moment and cruelty the next. The description fit too many people to be decisive, yet it lingered, adding weight to a narrative that had never been fully explored. Meanwhile, the living suspect continued to insist on his innocence, even as the walls closed in. Detectives obtained permission to search his property again, decades after the fact. The house had been renovated multiple times. Floors replaced, walls repainted, gardens reshaped. Whatever secrets it might once have held were likely long gone. And yet the search was conducted with ritualistic care, as if the act itself might provoke a reaction, a slip, a confession born not of evidence, but of exhaustion. Nothing of significance was found. Still, the absence felt deliberate rather than reassuring. The public's patience thinned to a thread. Opinion fractured. Some were convinced the police had their man and were simply failing to prove it. Others accused investigators of scapegoating an aging individual to mask earlier failures. The phrase cold case justice appeared in editorials, heavy with implication. For the family, the noise was unbearable. Every theory reduced their loss to a puzzle. Every headline reopened a wound they had never been allowed to close. In an effort to regain control, detectives turned inward, conducting a brutal review of their own methods. Why had certain leads been dismissed? Why had others been pursued so aggressively? They examined the biases of the late 1980s, the assumptions about gender, about crime, about who was likely to be dangerous and who was not. It became clear that the original investigation had been shaped as much by cultural blind spots as by limited technology. The realization did not solve the case, but it reframed it in ways that were impossible to ignore. One such blind spot involved proximity. In 1987, investigators had focused heavily on strangers, on the idea of an external threat. Familiar faces had been treated as inherently safer, less worthy of suspicion. Now, that logic felt dangerously naive. The reopened case challenged the comforting myth that danger announces itself loudly, that evil looks different from normality. Instead, it suggested something quieter, more unsettling. That harm could come from someone who blended seamlessly into daily life. This shift in thinking brought renewed attention to small, overlooked details. A casual remark made by the suspect during an early interview. A timeline discrepancy dismissed as stress. A witness who had felt uneasy but could not articulate why. Each detail was re-examined, weighed, and placed back into the narrative with greater care. Slowly, a more coherent picture began to emerge, though it was far from complete. Then came the phone records. Not the woman's. Hers ended abruptly, but those of people connected to her orbit. In 1987, records were crude, limited, but patterns still existed. Investigators noticed a cluster of calls made in the days following the disappearance, calls that did not make sense as expressions of concern or coordination. They traced them back to the suspect and one other individual, now deceased. The timing was awkward, the explanations thin. It did not prove collusion, but it suggested awareness. Confronted with this information, the suspect's demeanor changed again. Not dramatically, just enough. He grew more guarded, less expansive. Answers shortened. Eye contact faltered. He asked for breaks. He asked for clarification. The room filled with a tension that felt earned, not manufactured. Detectives pressed carefully, aware that pressure could either crack the truth or shatter the case beyond repair. The possibility of more than one person involved loomed larger now. A single individual could make a woman disappear, but coordination explained the precision, the staging, the lack of noise. It also explained the silence. Secrets are easier to keep when they are shared, bound by mutual risk. The idea sent a chill through the team. If true, it meant the case was not just old, but intentionally preserved in darkness. As the investigation teetered between revelation and collapse, a new witness came forward. Not with certainty, but with a story she had carried alone for decades. She claimed to have seen the woman get into the van willingly, laughing briefly, as if recognizing the person inside. At the time, she had assumed it was someone she knew. She had gone home and forgotten about it. Until the arrest. Until the headlines. Her memory was fragile, vulnerable to challenge, but it aligned disturbingly well with the emerging pattern. Detectives listened without interruption. They asked no leading questions. They knew the risk of shaping testimony too late in the game. When the interview ended, the room was silent. The implications were enormous. If the woman had entered the van willingly, even briefly, then the crime had begun with trust. And trust, once given, left no visible marks. As the case moved forward, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. Not the inevitability of resolution, but of confrontation. The truth, whatever it was, could no longer remain abstract. It was pressing against the edges of the investigation, demanding to be named. Yet with every step closer, detectives felt the ground shift beneath them. Because in cold cases like this, answers do not arrive cleanly. They emerge in fragments, contested and fragile. And sometimes, when the pieces finally come together, they reveal not a single villain, but a system of failures, choices, and silences that no arrest can fully repair. By now, the case had become a mirror, reflecting back everything the investigators feared about time, memory, and human behavior. Each new lead felt less like progress and more like a negotiation with the past, an agreement to accept uncertainty in exchange for movement. The question was no longer whether the truth existed, but whether it could still be reached without distortion. The theory of trust lingered in every room where the case was discussed. If the woman had entered the van willingly, even for a moment, then the crime had begun long before that night. It had begun in familiarity, in recognition, in the quiet lowering of defenses that no amount of street lighting could prevent. That possibility forced detectives to reconstruct not just her final hours, but her recent weeks, searching for subtle shifts, for relationships that had grown closer or more strained without leaving obvious traces. They examined diaries, notes, offhand comments recalled by friends who now questioned every memory. She had mentioned feeling watched once, casually, almost jokingly. No name attached. No urgency. Another friend recalled a disagreement, unresolved, but could not remember with whom. These fragments refused to assemble into a clear narrative, but they formed a background hum of unease that grew louder with each retelling. The suspect, still under intense scrutiny, began to show signs of strain. Surveillance reports noted changes in routine that suggested hyper-awareness rather than innocence. He avoided places he had once frequented. He altered travel times. He seemed to anticipate observation, as if aware of the invisible line following him through the city. Detectives debated whether this behavior indicated guilt or simple fear of being falsely accused. In a case this old, the difference was nearly impossible to define. Legal pressure mounted. Without charges, the window for intrusive investigative measures narrowed. Prosecutors cautioned restraint. Defense attorneys circled, ready to pounce on any procedural misstep. The investigation had to balance urgency with precision, a tightrope walk made more treacherous by public expectation. Every leak, every rumor threatened to contaminate potential testimony, to poison the well beyond repair. In a quiet moment of recalibration, the team returned to the physical evidence, limited as it was. The handbag, the shoe. Items once treated as static were now examined as dynamic elements in a sequence. Analysts questioned not just where they were found, but why. Why that bus stop? Why that distance? Why visible, but not scattered? The conclusion, tentative but compelling, suggested intentional placement, a message without words. The crime scene had been constructed to look like confusion, when in fact it was order pretending to be chaos. That insight reframed the suspect's earlier curiosity during interviews. His interest in forensic details could be read as concern, or as someone checking whether the story he had left behind was still holding. The ambiguity gnawed at detectives, who replayed footage, scrutinizing expressions frame by frame, searching for tells that might never exist. As attention intensified, the second narrative, the deceased man, began to recede, not because it lacked intrigue, but because it lacked traction. Without the ability to test reactions, to confront inconsistencies in real time, the lead grew colder by the day. Still, its existence mattered. It represented the possibility that the truth might never be singular, that responsibility could be diffuse, shared, or forever obscured by death. Then came the call that shifted the tone of the investigation once again. A woman, now living abroad, contacted police after seeing coverage of the reopened case. She claimed to have known the suspect in the late 1980s, socially, casually. She remembered him mentioning an incident, not as a confession, but as a story told with odd detachment. A woman, a misunderstanding, something that had gone wrong. At the time, she had dismissed it as bravado or fiction. Now, decades later, it returned to her with unsettling clarity. Her testimony was careful, measured, and devastating in its implications. She could not recall exact words. She could not place a date. But she remembered the tone, the absence of empathy, the way he had spoken as if recounting a minor inconvenience rather than a life-altering event. Detectives listened, aware of the fragility of memory and the power of suggestion. Still, they could not ignore the alignment with the emerging profile. Confronted with this account, the suspect reacted differently than before. Not defensive, not confused, withdrawn. He stared at the table for a long moment before responding, choosing his words with visible effort. He denied making such a statement. He suggested the witness was mistaken, influenced by media coverage. The denial was calm, but it lacked conviction. Or perhaps investigators wanted it to. As the case edged closer to its limits, a stark reality emerged. Without a body, without incontrovertible forensic evidence, the path to prosecution was narrow and unforgiving. The law demanded certainty. The case offered probability. The gap between the two felt insurmountable. Detectives were forced to consider whether the best they could achieve was not justice, but acknowledgement. An official recognition that something terrible had happened, even if it could not be proven beyond doubt. The community sensed the tension. Vigils were held. Candles lit. The woman's name, once fading, was spoken again with urgency and respect. People who had never known her felt invested in her story, drawn in by the possibility that the city might finally confront one of its lingering ghosts. The cold case had become a test of collective memory as much as investigative skill. In private, some detectives admitted their fear that the case would collapse under its own weight, that years of work would end not with resolution, but with a carefully worded statement about insufficient evidence. The thought was unbearable, not because of pride, but because of what it would mean for the family, for the city, for the idea that time did not automatically erase accountability. As the investigation entered what many suspected would be its final phase, the air grew heavy with expectation. Every interview felt consequential, every decision irreversible. The truth hovered just out of reach, close enough to sense, far enough to evade capture. And in that space, between knowing and proving, the case waited, silent and unyielding, daring someone to cross the final threshold. The final threshold, detectives would come to realize, was not a single moment, but a slow constriction, a tightening of options, a narrowing of air. By the time Part 7 of the reopened investigation unfolded, there was no room left for comfortable doubt. Every theory had been tested, bent, and stressed until only a few remained standing, and each of them pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion. The truth was close, but it was not going to arrive cleanly. What changed was not evidence, but posture. The suspect stopped trying to appear cooperative. Not openly hostile, not defiant, just closed. Conversations shortened. Answers lost their texture. Where he once filled silence with explanation, he now let it stretch, heavy and deliberate. Defense counsel became a constant presence. Interviews turned procedural, transactional. The room no longer felt like a place where revelations happened. It felt like a battleground where time was the primary weapon. Detectives adapted. If they could not move forward through confession or forensic certainty, they would move sideways, building pressure through context. They mapped the suspect's life in 1987 with forensic intimacy. His work schedule, his social habits, his routines, not as isolated facts, but as a system. And systems, unlike individuals, revealed patterns. One pattern stood out with brutal clarity. On nights when he claimed to be home alone, his movements were uncorroborated, yet consistent in one respect. They coincided with gaps in public activity. Quieter streets, reduced bus frequency, predictable lulls. It was not proof, but it was behavior. And behavior, repeated often enough, became evidence of intent rather than coincidence. The investigators returned again to the 12-minute window, that narrow corridor of time in which the disappearance had occurred. They rebuilt it using modern tools, digital reconstructions layered over historical data, sound propagation models, visibility analysis, crowd density estimates. The conclusion was chilling in its precision. Within that window, a vehicle could stop briefly without attracting attention. A conversation could take place without urgency. A person could enter a van without resistance. And once the vehicle moved, the opportunity was gone. That reconstruction was shown to the suspect during an interview, not as an accusation, but as an explanation. A way of saying, "We understand how it happened." His reaction was minimal. No visible panic. No anger. But his breathing changed. Slightly. Enough for the room to notice. Enough to be noted. Behind the scenes, prosecutors pressed for a decision. Either move toward charges or prepare to step back. The case was approaching a point where hesitation would look like weakness. Detectives argued for more time, for one more push, for the chance that pressure might extract what evidence could not. They were granted it reluctantly, with clear limits. Then came the breakthrough no one had predicted. Not from technology. Not from the suspect. But from silence finally breaking elsewhere. A former colleague of the suspect, now terminally ill, requested to speak with police. He had worked with the suspect briefly in the late 1980s. They had not been close. They had not stayed in touch. But he remembered a conversation that had stayed with him for decades, precisely because he had never understood it. The suspect had mentioned a woman who had gotten into trouble. The phrase had struck him as evasive even then. Not concern, not fear, just inconvenience. He had laughed it off at the time. Now, with nothing left to lose, he wanted it recorded. The statement was thin, fragile, easily attacked. But it joined a growing chorus of voices describing the same tone, the same detachment, the same absence of empathy. Individually, each memory could be dismissed. Together, they formed a portrait that was difficult to ignore. Confronted with this accumulation, the suspect finally showed something new. Not fear, resignation. He asked whether it mattered after all this time what anyone thought. He asked whether the city would be safer if he were blamed. The question hung in the room, heavy with implication. It was not a confession. It was not denial. It was a challenge. Detectives did not answer directly. They did not have to. The weight of the case was answering for them. Every file, every witness, every quiet recalculation. The suspect sat back, exhaled slowly, and said nothing more. The interview ended shortly after. Outside, the media sensed a shift. Leaks hinted at mounting pressure, at a case nearing decision. Headlines speculated about imminent charges. Others warned of collapse. The public mood swung between anticipation and dread. For some, any outcome would be better than the endless waiting. For others, the possibility of the wrong ending felt worse than no ending at all. The family was informed of developments in careful, measured language. They listened, nodding, absorbing each update with the practiced restraint of people long acquainted with disappointment. They did not ask for promises. They asked for honesty. Whether the truth could be proven. Whether the case could end without answers. The detectives had no comforting reply. As the days counted down, the investigation faced its defining question. Was the accumulation of probability enough to justify action? Or would action, without certainty, risk turning a search for truth into an act of narrative convenience? Cold cases did not end because they were solved. They ended because someone decided they could not continue. Late one evening, a senior officer reviewed the case alone. Lights dimmed, city noise muted beyond the window. He knew that whatever decision was made would echo far beyond the file. It would shape how the city understood justice, patience, and the limits of time. He closed the folder slowly, aware that the next time it was opened, it might be for the last time. And somewhere in the city, a man waited. Not in hiding, not on the run, just waiting, as he had perhaps for decades, knowing that silence, once broken, never fully returns. The decision did not arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, the way irreversible things often do, shaped by exhaustion as much as conviction. The Crown would proceed, not with certainty, with belief. The belief that the accumulation of fragments, patterns, and silence had crossed an invisible threshold. That a jury might see what investigators saw. That the story, imperfect and incomplete, was still strong enough to stand. When the news broke, it moved faster than the truth ever had. Charges considered. Cold case edges toward court. Suspect to face justice after 36 years. Each headline sharpened the public's appetite, even as officials urged caution. This was not a solved case. It was a case being tested. The suspect was informed in a small room, without cameras, without spectacle. He listened, expression unreadable, hands folded, posture controlled. When asked if he understood, he nodded once. No questions. No protest. Just a faint tightening around the eyes that could have meant anything or nothing at all. He left under escort, not resisting, not speaking. The absence of reaction unsettled those who witnessed it more than anger ever could have. Preparation became everything. Prosecutors and detectives worked in near isolation, constructing a narrative sturdy enough to withstand attack. Every witness statement was stress-tested. Every inconsistency anticipated. They knew the defense would focus on time, on memory decay, on the danger of retrofitting meaning onto coincidence. They were right. The defense strategy emerged quickly and ruthlessly. This was not about guilt, they argued. It was about reliability, about a system desperate for closure, reaching backward across decades to impose order on chaos. Witnesses were mistaken, memories contaminated, investigators biased by the desire to solve what had become symbolic rather than factual. The suspect, they said, was being punished for proximity, not proof. In response, the prosecution leaned into restraint. They avoided grand claims. They did not promise certainty. Instead, they presented the case as a convergence. Independent lines of inquiry, all pointing inward. Familiarity, opportunity, behavior, silence. They emphasized what had not happened as much as what had. No credible sightings after that night. No financial activity. No evidence of voluntary disappearance. The absence, they argued, was itself a presence. Courtroom sketches captured the tension. The suspect sat motionless, eyes forward, a study in stillness. Witnesses took the stand one by one, voices wavering as they revisited moments they had tried to forget. Some were confident, others were fragile, their recollections softened by time. The jury watched closely, aware that they were being asked not just to evaluate facts, but to weigh probability against doubt. One moment stood out. A reconstruction of the 12-minute window, presented without commentary, just visuals and timestamps. The room was silent as the sequence unfolded, the narrowness of the opportunity laid bare. It was not proof of action, but it was proof of possibility. And possibility, when aligned with pattern, carried weight. The defense dismantled witnesses with precision. They highlighted contradictions. They exposed uncertainty. They reminded the jury that memory was not a recording, but a reconstruction, vulnerable to suggestion and repetition. They asked why, if the case were so strong, it had taken so long to act. The implication was clear. Doubt had always been present, and it still was. Outside the courtroom, the city debated. Some saw the trial as overdue justice. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent, proof that time could turn suspicion into accusation. The phrase, trial by narrative, appeared in opinion columns. So did long-delayed accountability. The case had become more than itself. It had become a referendum on how society treated its unresolved past. For the family, the proceedings were both relief and torment. Each day brought validation and pain in equal measure. To hear her name spoken formally, in a place of authority, mattered. To hear her reduced to timelines and probabilities hurt in ways they had not anticipated. Closure, they realized, was not a single emotion. It was a series of compromises. As the trial progressed, the suspect remained an enigma. He did not testify. He did not react. When evidence touched close to him, he barely moved. Some jurors read this as composure, others as calculation. The ambiguity mirrored the case itself, and it left no one comfortable. In the final days, both sides rested. The courtroom held its breath. Closing arguments avoided theatrics. The prosecution spoke of responsibility, of the cost of silence, of how crimes could persist without witnesses if society demanded perfection before action. The defense spoke of restraint, of the danger of punishing certainty's absence, of the irreversibility of a wrong verdict. When the jury retired, the wait began again. Not the long wait of decades, but a sharper one, compressed and volatile. Hours stretched. The city watched, refreshed feeds, speculated. The cold case, once dormant, now stood at the edge of transformation. Whatever the verdict, everyone understood one thing. After this, the case would never return to the quiet it had known before. The act of reopening had changed it irrevocably. Truth, once disturbed, does not settle back into place. It demands a reckoning. And as the jury deliberated behind closed doors, the question that had haunted London since 1987 pressed in once more, heavier than ever. Not just what happened that night, but what, finally, would be done with what could never be fully known. The verdict did not come quickly. It arrived the way truth often does in cases like this, hesitant, fragmented, shaped by doubt rather than certainty. After days of deliberation, The jury returned with questions instead of answers, requests for transcripts, for clarifications, for the same testimony replayed again and again, as if repetition might sharpen meaning. Each request sent a tremor through the courtroom. Each pause felt like a verdict postponed, suspended in a space where time refused to behave. Inside the jury room, the debate fractured along predictable lines. Some jurors believed the convergence of evidence was too strong to ignore. Others clung to the gaps, the missing body, the reliance on memories stretched thin by decades. The law demanded a threshold that the case circled but never fully crossed. And yet, the weight of probability pressed down, heavy and uncomfortable, asking how many coincidences it took before coincidence ceased to be an explanation. When the jury finally returned, the atmosphere was brittle. No one breathed easily. The suspect stood as instructed, face unreadable. The family held hands, bracing for impact. The foreperson spoke slowly, carefully, as if aware that each word would ripple outward far beyond the room. The verdict was not guilty, not innocent, something else. A failure to reach unanimity. A hung jury. The sound that followed was not an outcry, but a release of tension so abrupt it felt almost violent. Murmurs spread. Cameras clicked. The judge called for order, but the moment had already escaped control. The case had not ended. It had simply refused to resolve. Prosecutors faced an immediate decision: retry or step back. The legal calculus was brutal. Another trial would expose the same weaknesses, invite the same attacks, exhaust witnesses already stretched to their limits. And yet, abandoning the case would feel like surrender, an admission that decades of effort had led nowhere. The cold case hovered in a liminal state, neither solved nor dormant, suspended once again between action and inertia. Public reaction was swift and divided. Some hailed the verdict as a victory for restraint, proof that the justice system still demanded proof over passion. Others saw it as a betrayal, a technical escape that denied accountability. The suspect walked free again, not exonerated, but unconvicted, carrying the weight of suspicion without the clarity of judgment. He said nothing as he left the courthouse, eyes forward, shoulders tight, disappearing into a city that no longer felt anonymous. For the family, the verdict was devastating in its ambiguity. Not guilty would have been a door slammed shut. Guilty would have been a painful kind of closure. This was neither. It was an echo, a return to waiting, to living with questions that refused to settle. They spoke briefly to the press, voices steady, words chosen with care. They asked only that the case not be forgotten again. Inside the investigation team, morale fractured. Some believed the trial had gone as well as it ever could have. Others felt the case had been pushed too far, too fast, driven by the pressure of time rather than the readiness of evidence. Quiet arguments unfolded in offices and corridors, not about guilt or innocence, but about responsibility. To the victim, to the public, to the truth itself. Then came the unexpected consequence. The trial, even without a verdict, had loosened tongues. People who had stayed silent for decades now came forward, emboldened by the visibility of the case. Most had nothing new to offer. A few did. A former neighbor recalled a heated exchange weeks before the disappearance, dismissed at the time as trivial. A retired bus inspector mentioned a report filed and forgotten about a vehicle stopped improperly near the route that night. Small things, late things, but real. Investigators, given temporary leave to reassess, followed these leads with renewed caution. They were no longer chasing resolution. They were chasing understanding. The suspect remained a central figure, but no longer the only one. The possibility that the truth was distributed across multiple failures, multiple moments of inattention, became harder to ignore. One lead in particular gnawed at them. A storage facility on the outskirts of the city, linked indirectly to the suspect through a third party, now deceased. Records showed irregular access in the late 1980s. Nothing illegal, nothing definitive, but the timing aligned uncomfortably well with the disappearance. The facility had changed ownership twice since then. Units cleared, contents discarded. Whatever might have been there was gone. The cold case had reached a familiar impasse, but it felt different now. The silence was louder. The city more aware. The idea that the truth might exist without ever being provable settled in like a permanent fog. This was the cost of time. Not just lost evidence, but diluted certainty. As months passed, the question of a retrial loomed. Prosecutors delayed, weighing public interest against legal reality. The suspect lived under a cloud, every movement observed by a society that could not decide what it believed. He was neither free nor condemned, trapped in the gray space the case had always occupied. Late one evening, a detective reviewed the case timeline again, not for the 100th time, but for the last. He realized something then, something unsettling in its simplicity. The case had never been about a single moment. It had been about accumulation, of silence, of missed chances, of assumptions left unchallenged. The disappearance was not just an act. It was a process. And that process was still unfolding. As London moved on, as it always did, the cold case remained, reshaped but unresolved, a reminder that some truths do not arrive with verdicts or confessions. They arrive as shadows, stretching across years, refusing to be outrun. The question now was not whether the case would ever be solved. It was whether the city could live with the answer it might never have. Time did not heal the case after the trial. It sharpened it. The absence of a verdict became a presence of its own, shaping conversations in courtrooms, newsrooms, and quiet kitchens across the city. The cold case had slipped into a new phase, one more dangerous than dormancy because it carried momentum without direction. Everyone involved understood that what happened next would determine whether the case faded again or transformed into something else entirely. Prosecutors delayed their decision, week after week, measuring the cost of a retrial against the probability of a different outcome. They revisited every exhibit, every witness, every moment where the jury had hesitated. The conclusion was uncomfortable but clear. A second trial would not add certainty. It would repeat doubt. Without new evidence, the risk of another deadlock or an outright acquittal was too great. The system, designed to deliver clarity, was admitting its limits. When the announcement came, it was carefully worded. No retrial at this time. The phrase landed heavily, echoing with implication. The case was not closed. It was not abandoned. It was suspended, once again, in a state that felt familiar and intolerable. The suspect would remain under investigation, but free from immediate legal threat. The public reaction was swift, sharp, and contradictory. Some called it a failure of courage. Others called it restraint. Few felt satisfied. For investigators, the decision forced a reckoning. Without the structure of a trial, the case returned to its raw form, questions without a forum, theories without deadlines. But something fundamental had changed. The reopening had cracked the shell of silence that had protected the past. People were watching now, listening, remembering. Detectives quietly reoriented their efforts. They stopped chasing confessions and began cataloging consequences. How the disappearance had altered routines. How fear had reshaped behavior. How one unresolved night had quietly influenced decades of decision-making. This was not evidence in the legal sense, but it was context, and context they believed might still lead somewhere. The suspect receded from view, deliberately. He moved residences, limited contact, avoided places associated with the case. Not hiding but retreating. His lawyers advised silence. He followed it. The city interpreted his withdrawal according to its own biases. Guilt to some, self-preservation to others. The ambiguity persisted, unresolved and corrosive. Meanwhile, the family faced a different kind of endurance. They had lived for years with uncertainty, but the trial had raised expectations they could not now unfeel. Closure had seemed within reach, close enough to touch. Its retreat was cruel in a way time alone had never been. Still, they refused to disengage. They spoke publicly, not with accusation, but with insistence. That the case mattered. That forgetting would be the greatest injustice of all. In the background, Investigators followed a lead that had survived every cut: the storage facility. The more they examined it, the more it felt like a hinge point rather than a solution. Not a place where answers waited, but a place where they had once passed through. Records were incomplete. Surveillance non-existent. Staff long gone. Yet the pattern of access suggested purpose. Brief visits. Odd hours. No explanation that fit comfortably. They traced the facility's history outward, mapping connections rather than contents. Who knew whom? Who introduced whom? The web was thin, fragile, but real. It suggested not a conspiracy, but convenience. People who crossed paths without recognizing the significance of the moment. People who later forgot or chose to. The investigation slowed, not because it had failed, but because it had matured. Detectives stopped expecting revelation. They focused instead on accumulation, waiting for the weight of small truths to shift something larger. Cold cases, they knew, rarely ended with spectacle. They ended with attrition. As months passed, media attention waned. New stories replaced old outrage. The case slipped back toward the margins of public consciousness, though it never fully disappeared. It lingered as a reference point, a shorthand for unresolved loss. Like that London cold case, people would say, invoking it without needing to explain. Then, quietly, something surfaced. Not evidence. Not a confession. A document. An internal memo from the late 1980s, misfiled, overlooked, now rediscovered during a routine archive review. It referenced a tip that had never been followed up. A vehicle sighted leaving the area earlier than previously thought. A detail that shifted the timeline by minutes. Only minutes. But in a case built on a 12-minute window, minutes mattered. The memo did not name a suspect. It did not solve anything. But it altered the geometry of the night just enough to unsettle established assumptions. Detectives revisited the reconstruction, adjusting variables, recalculating movement. A new possibility emerged, uncomfortable and destabilizing. That the disappearance may not have unfolded exactly as they believed. That the order of events could have been reversed. That staging might have occurred earlier, not later. The realization was both energizing and devastating. Energizing because it reopened avenues thought closed. Devastating because it confirmed what many had feared. That the case had never been as stable as it appeared. That every conclusion rested on foundations eroded by time. As the investigation absorbed this new uncertainty, one truth crystallized. The case would not end with a verdict. It would end, if at all, with understanding. An understanding partial and flawed, but honest about its limits. And somewhere in the city, life continued. Streets filled. Doors closed. Vans idled at traffic lights. Ordinary moments unfolded without noticing the weight they carried. The cold case remained embedded in the fabric of London, not as a story with an ending, but as a reminder. That some nights never truly pass. That some questions once asked do not accept silence as an answer. And that the distance between knowing and proving can be as wide and as unforgiving as time itself. The final chapter of the case did not announce itself with sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly, the way unresolved things often do, slipping into the city's bloodstream until it became impossible to separate memory from present tense. London had learned to live with the cold case the way it lives with fog, never fully seen, never entirely gone, shaping the way people moved without asking permission. The newly adjusted timeline changed how investigators spoke about the night. They no longer described it as a straight line from disappearance to silence. They described it as a distortion, a sequence bent by intention. Someone somewhere had understood the value of minutes. Someone had acted early, decisively, before panic could attract attention. That knowledge alone reframed everything. This was not chaos. It was control. Detectives revisited interviews conducted decades earlier, listening not for facts but for rhythm, where voices tightened, where pauses lingered too long, where certainty arrived too quickly. Memory, they knew, decayed unevenly. Some details sharpened over time, polished by repetition. Others blurred until only emotion remained. The trick was distinguishing truth from familiarity. One witness, long dismissed as unreliable, began to stand out, not because of what they claimed to see, but because of what they insisted on not remembering. A refusal that had once seemed evasive now felt deliberate. Investigators requested a new interview. The witness declined. Not out of fear, they said. Out of exhaustion. The case had taken enough, they insisted. But exhaustion, detectives noted, often followed proximity. The suspect remained untouched by these developments, at least publicly. No charges. No statements. His name surfaced occasionally in articles, always accompanied by qualifiers. Alleged. Accused. Suspected. Words that hovered without landing. He lived in the shadow of implication, a state neither free nor condemned. Those who believed in his guilt called it justice delayed. Those who doubted it called it persecution prolonged. The truth, as always, refused to clarify itself. Behind closed doors, investigators debated whether truth even remained accessible. Evidence aged. Memories calcified. Motives dissolved. The case had become an archaeological site rather than a crime scene. Every movement risked collapse. Every discovery raised new questions instead of closing old ones. The family understood this better than anyone. They had stopped expecting answers that fit neatly into sentences. What they wanted now was acknowledgement that the disappearance was not an abstraction, that it had not become merely a case study. They spoke of birthdays uncelebrated, routines broken, a voice that never aged in memory. Their grief had evolved from shock to endurance, a quiet discipline maintained year after year. When asked what justice would look like, they no longer spoke of prison or verdicts. They spoke of honesty, of someone somewhere finally saying what they knew, even if it came too late to change anything else. The city listened briefly, then moved on again. News cycles tightened. Attention shifted. But something subtle had changed. The reopening, the arrest, the trial without resolution, these events had lodged the case permanently into public consciousness. It was no longer just an old mystery. It was a warning. About certainty. About time. About the limits of systems built by people who believed answers would always arrive before memory failed. Years passed without formal movement. The case remained technically open, though functionally dormant. Detectives retired. Files transferred hands. The boxes grew heavier with annotations, lighter with hope. And yet, the case never returned to the silence it once knew. It lived on in classrooms, in journalism seminars, in whispered conversations about what justice really meant. Every so often, a tip would arrive. A letter with no return address. A call from someone claiming sudden recollection. Each one investigated. Each one faded. Not because they were lies, but because truth, when delayed long enough, loses its ability to be proven. The final investigative memo did not declare failure. It declared uncertainty. It acknowledged the likelihood that the full sequence of events might never be reconstructed. That responsibility might never be assigned with legal confidence. That the cold case would remain cold, not from neglect, but from complexity. And still, the case refused to end. Because endings require consensus. And consensus was the one thing the case had never achieved. London continued to carry the weight of that unresolved night. It lived in the architecture, in the underpasses and storage units and streets where footsteps once mattered. It lived in the habits of caution passed down unknowingly. Lock the door earlier. Walk together. Notice fans. Small behaviors shaped by a story without a conclusion. The cold case became a mirror. For the city. For the justice system. For anyone who believed that time alone could clarify the past. It asked uncomfortable questions and offered no comfort in return. It reminded listeners that not all mysteries exist to be solved, and not all truths arrive intact. Somewhere, someone knows exactly what happened that night. That knowledge exists, isolated and unchanged, unaffected by headlines or hearings. It has waded through decades of speculation and silence. Whether it will ever surface remains uncertain. What is certain is this: the case did not disappear. It embedded itself in memory, in caution, in the understanding that some absences are louder than answers. The London 1987 cold case remains open, not on paper, but in the minds of those who still listen for what was never said, and in the quiet spaces between certainty and doubt, where the truth has learned how to hide. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It carried the residue of everything that had been said and everything that had not. The case lived in that silence now, stretched thin across decades, vibrating whenever someone brushed too close to the truth. Investigators knew this stage well. It was the long aftermath, when a case stops moving forward but refuses to settle, when every new year feels heavier than the last because nothing has changed except the distance from the beginning. Behind locked doors, the file was still open from time to time, not out of procedure but habit. A detective would sit with it, late in the evening, turning pages that had grown soft at the edges. Statements reread, so often they felt memorized. Photographs that no longer shocked but still unsettled. The case had lost its urgency, but not its gravity. It pulled at anyone who looked too long. What lingered most was the sense of orchestration. The adjusted timeline, the early movements, the deliberate gaps. The night no longer felt like an accident of circumstance. It felt designed. Not meticulously, not brilliantly, but intentionally enough to leave no clean trail. Someone had known what not to leave behind. Someone had understood how little was needed to create confusion that could last a lifetime. The storage facility remained a ghost in the narrative. Not a crime scene, not an alibi, but a node. A place that appeared whenever the investigation drifted too far in any direction, pulling it back toward ambiguity. Detectives wondered if it had been used, or merely mentioned to be feared. Sometimes the power of a place lies not in what happens there, but in what people believe could have happened. New generations of officers inherited the case, without inheriting its emotional weight. To them, it was an artifact, a famous cold case, a cautionary tale taught in training rooms. They studied it for mistakes, not answers. Missed follow-ups. Assumptions accepted too easily. Confidence mistaken for certainty. The case became instructional, stripped of its human cost, until someone would mention the family and the room would quiet again. The suspect aged. Time marked him in visible ways. Hair thinning, posture stiffening. He became less a figure of threat and more a symbol of unresolved accusation. He did not flee. He did not confess. He lived in the narrow corridor between suspicion and freedom, watched less closely as years passed, though never fully released from the shadow that followed him. Occasionally, someone would claim to have seen him somewhere familiar. A bus stop, a grocery aisle, ordinary places where ordinary life continued. Each sighting reignited small waves of anger or doubt. People argued about what justice meant when certainty could not be reached. Some believed the absence of punishment was an injustice. Others believed the absence of proof was its own answer. The city never agreed. The family grew older too. Parents became grandparents without the missing presence that should have bridged generations. They learned to speak of the case in the past tense without accepting that it belonged there. Their grief adapted. It no longer demanded resolution. It demanded recognition. They attended anniversaries not to reopen wounds, but to remind the world that the wound had never closed. On one such anniversary, a journalist asked a question that lingered longer than intended. What if the truth was already known, just not provable? The answer came slowly. Then it came, honestly. That possibility had always existed. From the first year, from the first suspect, from the first time evidence failed to align. The system, designed to protect against error, could also protect against conclusion. The case file contained many truths, none of them definitive. Each one partial, fragile, contested. Together, they formed a portrait not of a single act, but of a moment in time when confidence outran caution and urgency eclipsed patience. The crime itself was singular. Its aftermath was collective. Late one evening, an investigator made a note in the margin of the file. Not an official entry, just a thought. that the case might never end because it was not meant to, that some crimes dissolve into the lives they disrupt, becoming part of the environment rather than an event within it. The note was never archived. It was never shared. But it felt true. London continued to change. Streets were rebuilt. Buildings repurposed. Old storage units demolished or converted into luxury flats. Physical traces vanished. Only memory remained, unreliable and selective. And yet, whenever someone mentioned the year, the reaction was immediate. A pause. A narrowing of attention. The case still had power. Not because it promised answers, but because it denied them. Cold cases are often described as sleeping. This one was not asleep. It was waiting. Waiting for something unpredictable. A mistake. A moment of conscience. A detail remembered too late. Investigators knew that if resolution ever came, it would not arrive through method alone. It would arrive through fracture. Until then, the case remained what it had become. A presence rather than a puzzle. A reminder rather than a mystery. It asked nothing. It accused no one directly. It simply existed, heavy and unresolved, reminding anyone who looked too closely that certainty is fragile and time is not a solution. The London 1987 cold case did not fade. It settled. And in settling, it ensured that the question it left behind would never fully disappear. The case did not end with a closing file or a final statement. It thinned out instead, like a sound fading into distance, still audible long after the source had stopped moving. Those who had lived closest to it could feel when it resurfaced. A name spoken to casually. A photograph shared online. A date that arrived without warning. The cold case had learned how to survive without attention. In its later years, the investigation existed mostly as vigilance. Not action, not pursuit, but watchfulness. A quiet agreement among those who knew it best that if something shifted, however slightly, they would notice. That if the past cracked, even by accident, someone would be there to hear it. This was not optimism. It was discipline. The suspect continued to age into anonymity. He became easier to overlook, which unsettled some and relieved others. To those convinced of his guilt, his quiet life felt like an insult carried out in slow motion. To those unsure, it felt like proof that suspicion alone could not substitute for truth. He was no longer followed by cameras but by memory, the kind that does not require proof to persist. Every so often, the city tried to let go. A new generation asked why the case still mattered. Why an unresolved night from the 1980s deserved space in modern conversation. The answers were never simple, because it revealed how easily certainty could be constructed, because it showed how systems reacted under pressure, because it proved that not all harm announces itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, patient, embedded. The disappearance had shaped policies quietly, procedures revised, timelines questioned more aggressively. Tips documented with greater care. No official statement ever linked those changes directly to the case, but those inside the system understood. The cold case had become a silent instructor. Its lessons paid for an absence. The family remained present, though less visible. They had learned that attention was a currency that depleted quickly. Instead, they focused on endurance, on keeping the name alive without demanding spectacle. They spoke when asked. They answered questions without embellishment. Their restraint carried its own weight. It reminded listeners that grief did not need volume to be legitimate. In private moments, they acknowledged what few dared to say aloud. That the full truth might never surface. That accountability might remain incomplete. Accepting that reality did not mean surrender. It meant redefining what justice could look like when the ideal was unreachable. Memory. Recognition. Refusal to erase. The city itself seemed to understand this intuitively. The places tied to the case were no longer marked, but they were not forgotten either. Locals spoke of them with lowered voices, as if proximity still mattered, as if certain streets remembered more than others. Urban legends formed, not dramatic, but persistent. A van that never stopped, a figure seen and then lost. Stories that carried no proof, only atmosphere. Investigators who revisited the file in later years noticed something unexpected. The case had stopped feeling chaotic. The unanswered questions were still there, but they no longer collided. They sat in uneasy alignment, suggesting not confusion, but containment. Whatever had happened that night had been held together long enough to evade collapse. That realization was unsettling. It implied competence, or luck, or both. The final assessment, never formally published, avoided conclusions. It spoke instead of probability, of scenarios more consistent than others, of gaps that resisted closure. It acknowledged the arrest, the trial, the public shock. It documented the renewed attention and the eventual return to quiet. It did not claim resolution. It claimed responsibility, to remember accurately, to resist narrative comfort. Years turned. The case crossed a threshold few reach. It moved from contemporary memory into historical consciousness. Students studied it without emotional proximity. Journalists referenced it as precedent. It became a lens rather than a wound. And yet, for those who had been there, it never changed shape. It remained immediate, present, sharp. Sometimes, late at night, someone would still call the non-emergency line. Not with information, but with unease. A memory stirred by a dream. A face recognized too late. Operators logged the calls respectfully. Investigators followed up when possible. Most led nowhere, but none were dismissed outright. The case had taught them that dismissal was irreversible. The cold case also left behind a quieter legacy. It changed how people spoke about disappearance. Less assumption, less certainty, more space for the unknown. It introduced caution into conversations that once relied on confident conclusions. In that way, it reshaped understanding beyond its own boundaries. No final confession arrived. No deathbed admission. No document surfaced to rewrite the narrative cleanly. The truth remained fragmented, distributed across memories, places, and silences. Somewhere within that fragmentation, the full story existed. Complete. Intact. Untouched by speculation. Whether it would ever align with proof was another question entirely. The case taught an uncomfortable lesson. That some answers do not come from effort alone. That time does not guarantee clarity. That the line between knowing and proving can stretch indefinitely. It forced those who followed it to confront the limits of investigation and the endurance required to live without resolution. London carried on as cities do. Its noise layered over old echoes. Its movement smoothing sharp edges. But the cold case never dissolved into background entirely. It remained just close enough to surface when certainty was assumed too easily. A reminder. A warning. The night in 1987 did not end when morning came. It extended. It unfolded across decades. It altered lives not through revelation, but through absence. And in doing so, it carved out a space where mystery was not an obstacle to understanding, but a part of it. The London 1987 cold case stands unresolved. Not because no one tried. Not because no one cared. But because some truths, once delayed long enough, learn how to exist without being named. And in that quiet endurance, the case continues. Not as a question waiting for an answer, but as an absence that refuses to be forgotten.